Hi, we continue in Luke 12 today after Jesus is responding to the anonymous person who interrupted him, demanding that Jesus resolve the dispute with the man and his brother over his inheritance. But Jesus did not respond to that dispute other than to ask why he was chosen to be judge or arbiter of that dispute, and went on to tell the story about the rich farmer who didn't realize his life was demanded the very night that his big harvest was coming in, and he was planning to store it up for many years to come. So in that story, we see the foolishness of people who rely on their wealth to make them self-enclosed and are separate both from God and from their neighbors. Now he turns to his disciples, as you can see on the left side of the screen in verse 22, where the issue is exactly the opposite. The disciples, not necessarily inherently poor, and by disciples here, I'm referring not just to the people in the story who have left all, like Peter, leaving his successful fishing business to join Jesus, but Luke's audience of young adult Romans who are being educated in paideia, the educational process that is more than just skills, but indoctrination into the whole Roman worldview, including its hierarchy of patronage, etc., and its view that the Roman gods support them. And so people who left that to be baptized and to join with Jesus, or are thinking of that, are going to be afraid of the fact that they've lost friends, or there might be consequences, violent or otherwise, from their former friends who are now their enemies. But also they could easily lose all the economic links that the patronage system makes possible. And not just patronage system like if you're a powerful person and you're connected through a round of clients, but just the ordinary aspects of life that respond to the reality that despite PhDs in economics, business is about who you know and the network you build. And so that was true in a capitalist world now, or in a non-capitalist world of the Roman Empire. So Jesus' disciples, again, those in the audience more than in the story, could easily be anxious about if we follow Jesus and if we're willing to testify publicly that we reject the way of the empire and are relying solely on the way of God, where will we get our provisions? And so that's what's at issue in the story as we continue to follow from chapter 11 the theme of true prayer, allowing one to see clearly the distinction between the two realms, the realm of Rome and Satan, and the realm of God and the kingdom of God. So that's where we are here, and as I noted last time from the work of Andrew Shepard, he had noted that many scholars see the story of the rich fool and this story that follows now is completely separate, but they're not, as Shepard showed and as I've tried to show, all continuing to follow the same theme here as we go. This time Luke is following along with Matthew. We saw last time that Luke used pieces from Matthew found in various places along with a piece from Mark. But here Matthew, in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount here in Matthew 6, and Luke here in a very different context, are very similar. The bold parts are the parts that are the same, and the non-bolded parts are the parts that are unique to each one. And they're really very little difference. Matthew has generically look at the birds of the air, and birds of the air has a particular symbolic meaning in the Bible, and maybe that's why Matthew chose it. We're not going to look at that because Luke has consider ravens in particular, and so we'll look at ravens in particular. Other small differences. Luke has just lilies, but Matthew has lilies of the field, highlighting wild lilies perhaps, although there's really not much difference there either. So they're really just minor changes other than the context, although Luke at the end has some advice. Matthew's advice is simply to let today's troubles be enough for today and not to be anxious about tomorrow. So his has to do with not worrying about the future. But Luke's has much more specific advice to sell your possessions, give alms, and have your treasure be in heaven. That's where your heart will be. So we'll get there when we get there. But today we're just going to go up to the Solomon part. So we've been looking at the key words here as well, and plainly one of the key words here is anxious, anxiety. It's translated in the NORSV as worry, but I've translated it consistently as anxious because I think that really resonates more with what was going on then and what's going on now. That anxiety can be debilitating, and it's a serious anxiety if one is concerned about not having enough food or clothing. And we can note that can happen because one is poor, and it can happen because one is a defector or defective, at least from the perspective of empire, that one is choosing to defect in the sense of withdrawing allegiance to that. So it's a serious issue. It's not just an abstraction. And if we find, as I do, that I've got a refrigerator full of food and a credit card that can take me to the store, or even call up and have the food delivered to my door almost as much as I could possibly want, want, then this isn't a real issue. But for Luke's audience, or for anybody today who would really choose to side completely with God and go against their nation state or against the economic system that is normal, most likely capitalism in the Western world, that could seriously cost one relationships. And I certainly know I've been invited to speak to a group of business people, for example, in downtown Seattle about the book of Revelation, and I said to the leader, or the inviter, you realize the book of Revelation calls for complete renunciation of wealth and the market economy, and I was not invited to speak. And so that was a small loss for me, but what if I was not invited to speak anywhere? What if I had lost my teaching job, and what if I had no source of income? Then it would be much more serious. So perhaps you can imagine a discipleship situation where you were faced with the reality we have here. So he says to them, therefore, and notice this follows from what we saw above, from the parable. So even though the parable was in response to an interruption, this is clearly part of the theme that Jesus wants him to talk about. As my note below says, the admonitions against worry or anxiety are linked with the preceding warnings about the danger of hoarding wealth. Further, in the narrative context, witnessing to the powers about the empire of God will likely cause one to be marginalized or expelled from Roman society, highlighting what I've just been telling you. So do not be anxious about your life, and here life is pasuke, and it will be throughout this little passage here, and I've highlighted that here. Earlier it was zoe, and here it was pasuke too. That's why I translated this consistently here. But sometimes it's zoe. So here consistently it's going to be pasuke, and plainly it can't mean soul there, because your soul isn't worried about what it's going to eat, and that's the parallel. Not to be anxious about your pasuke, what you'll eat, or your body or soma, and what you will wear here. For life is more than clothing. It is pasuke all the way through, as we can see here. So life is more than food here, trophes, only here in Luke, but it's a number of times in Acts. And the body more than clothing, and Duma only here in Luke. And it's parallel in Matthew, 6 more times in Matthew. That's one of those examples where it seems like Luke's getting it from Matthew, but we're not going to worry about those details. So having said that, he gives a couple of examples. And I think these examples are just perfect examples of the contrast that I call the religion of empire and the religion of creation. We've seen that throughout this section, but I really want to focus on it here, as my note below is indicating, an anti-agricultural surplus theme. So consider here, katanoin here, and in verse 27. So it really means to consider. Think about ravens. Ravens, Caracas here, which Matthew has birds of the sky. There are ravens elsewhere, but I'd like to turn to Shepherd here, who has some important things to say about ravens, and rather than read them as copied quotes, we can read them directly from his article. First, he starts negatively with those references to Leviticus and Deuteronomy that I have in my note in the lower left. He says, ravens were unclean. They often scavenged from human rubbish, fed on carrion, or worse, turned up at battlefields to eat the flesh of those killed. In first century Jewish thought and historically through a range of cultures, ravens were often linked to war, destruction, annihilation, and death. But there's more to ravens than meets the eye. They were still seen as both as recipients of God's gracious provision, there in Job and Psalm 147, and in the episode of Elijah being fed by ravens, also as agents of God's grace. And he goes down further to say, could it be that Jesus also has us consider ravens because of the similarities between this bird and us? And he notes further, as Debbie Blue writes, the raven is smart, it's wily and adaptable, it likes to eat flesh and have sex. It seems to me that the raven is not entirely unlike us. And that may be. And even the negative things, well, that's not so far from humans, is it either? We might not eat the flesh of dead animals and things, but we certainly cause a lot of dead flesh through war and abandonment, etc. So consider the ravens as very specific. And what they don't do is practice agriculture. And that's so important here, because in the religion of empire, agriculture is the primary basis for wealth. And it's justified, like in Babylon through the Enuma Elish, or through various other divine mythologies that suggest that agriculture is the way of God. But as we saw in my Genesis series back in the garden story, agriculture is the curse. The Adam is sentenced to fight with the earth for food rather than to receive the food in the garden that God provided for free. So this is really a call back to the original purpose of God in Genesis, that humans would act according to God, just like all the other animals do. So let's look a little more closely at sowing and reaping. It was in the parable of the sower, of course, because spiro literally means to seed, to spread seed. We see it here, and we see it in 19, 20, and 21, 22, and let's look at that, because this is the end of a story that's plainly a thinly veiled allegory about how Herod got authority, and the person who is the hero of the story is the one who refuses to participate in the imperial economy. And he expresses it this way: I was afraid of you, someone who can kill the body, and does at the end of this story, because you are a harsh man. You take what you did not deposit and reap what you did not sow. And partly that's connected to the rich man whose land produced that we saw in the last story, who he didn't do anything. The land produced it by itself. And so here reap and sow are used metaphorically, but plainly connecting here that humans either sow or reap literally in agriculture, or they sow and reap in a capitalist sense by planting money and sowing the benefits, as we see in that little parable. But the ravens don't do that. And further, they have neither storehouses, temion here, as in 12:3, or in Matthew 6:6, the inner room in a house, or the barn, apotheke, as in 12:18. Let's go back to see there. We saw, I will pull down my barns. And so the direct contrast is between the rich man who wants to build bigger barns and the ravens who need no barns at all. And yet God feeds them. How much more value are you than birds? And we'll see many comparisons of greater and lesser in this section, and we see it in addition to right in the next verse. So it's a beautiful story calling humans to trust in the God of creation, just like in Exodus 16 when they left Egypt and wondered where the food was, and God gives them the manna, a food which in Hebrew simply means what is it. So it's a call to rediscover the bounty of creation. And as I've said to students when I was teaching in the classroom, how many of you are prepared right now to walk out of this classroom and just go out on the earth and eat? And of course they're not, because we don't train our children that way, at least in the urban environment we don't, and so we don't have the skills. So it's a whole invitation to a radical rewilding, and many people have written about that, and I'll provide some links to that in the notes. So he continues, can any of you, by worrying or being anxious, and there's an ambiguity here, add a single hour, or is it hour? It's literally cubit, which is not a usual unit for time. It's usually a unit for length, but it's not the Roman unit. It's an ancient biblical unit from the Hebrew, so it's a really unusual way to describe it here. To your span, which could be, helikion here could be your height as well as your length of life. So it could be a single arm's length or half arm's length. The cubit is from the fingertip to the elbow. To your height, and the answer either way, whether it's about time or length, is no. So then if you're not able to do such a small thing, another one of these comparisons, elekisthon here, and we'll see it in two other times, comparing a small thing to a greater thing. If you can't do the small thing, how much more can you not do the hard thing? Or if you can do the small thing, how much more will you be trusted to do a large thing? Why do you worry about the rest, the lopi, the things that are left over? Then the metaphor shifts. Consider the lilies. And the word for lily, krina here, as lexicon notes, is any one of several types of flowers, usually uncultivated, or wildflowers, hence Matthew's lilies of the field. But we can certainly see lilies as certainly an example of that, and their beauty is highlighted in the Song of Songs, where they're mentioned 8 times as a description of the woman's body. So he says, consider the lilies, how they grow. And notice with the ravens, there was no parallel here. It wasn't the ravens how they eat or how they get food. It's just they neither sow nor reap. So consider the lilies, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. Toil is a word that can apply to men, but spinning is plainly women's work. And the word for spinning in the Greek here, nephai, is only in the Septuagint and Exodus. It's in Exodus a number of times, but notice this passage in Exodus 35, all the skillful women spun with their hands. And so plainly women's work there. So the men's work of the barns and gathering into barns, and the women's work of spinning, recognizing that agriculture brings about the gender division of labor, just as we see in Genesis, when the man will fight with the earth for food, and the women will have many childbirths. And so that was the curse. And so what Jesus is subtly calling people to is to be away from the original curse, which was not only a lot of work, but separated the genders into specific roles that they could not easily get out of. So attacks both on agriculture and gender roles there in one little phrase. And yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory, and here you can see him with the Queen of Sheba, whether that's all his glory or not isn't exactly clear, but it's a wonderful scene comparing the greatest king in Israel's history, at least as described by the authors of First Kings in his glory. Josiah is considered the greatest king, but Solomon, with his gold plates and his retinue, etc., is certainly the most glorious in the sense of literally the most shiny, which is the original meaning of the Hebrew kabod, is to be shiny or reflective. So Solomon in all his glory being compared to a mere flower, which in the next verse God says is thrown into the oven tomorrow. What a perfect contrast with the religion of creation and the religion of empire. The religion of empire produces Solomon, and the religion of creation creates a flower, and Jesus says, you should be much more like the flower than like Solomon. So it's a radical act of trust that's being called for then and now, to trust that the abundance of creation provides all we need to eat. And yet indigenous peoples all over this planet lived that way literally for thousands of years until agriculture pushed them out. Perhaps it's even possible that we, like Luke's original audience, can hear this as good news and return to it. Tomorrow we'll continue with Jesus helping to move his audience away from anxiety to deeper trust in God. See you then for that. Bye-bye.